Hey there, I just finished this book called Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, and I wanted to share what I learned in it. The first thing I learned in this book is the definition of an introvert. So previously, I thought that the definition of an introvert is somebody who gains energy from being alone, and an extrovert is somebody who gains energy from being with people. But in this book, the author Susan Cain takes a different approach. She basically says that the definition of an introvert is somebody who is drawn to an inner world of thoughts and feelings, whereas an extrovert is somebody who is drawn to the external world and groups of people. And I really like that distinction because in the older definition that I had in my mind with this idea of where you draw energy from, I wasn't really sure if I was an introvert or an extrovert because there's times where I can draw a lot of energy from being alone and reading a book, but then there's times where I might be with a group of friends or with my family and actually draw a lot of energy from that as well. And I like that idea of what you're drawn to a lot better than what gives you energy because when I think about what I'm drawn to, it really is that idea of inner thoughts and feelings. And that can be either through being alone, reading a book, or writing, but it can also be through intimate conversation, which Kane says is another thing that introverts are really drawn to. The second thing that I found really interesting in this book is this history of how American culture came to celebrate extroverts. In the book, Kane tells this story about how America in the 20th century went from being a culture of character to a culture of personality. In the beginning of the 20th century, Kane says that we were a culture of character that celebrated things like modesty. So in this culture, people like Abraham Lincoln were the heroes who were very quiet and unassuming. But as American cities and the economy changed and tons of people moved into the city and people were no longer working with their neighbor and were now working with coworkers and fellow employees in maybe a factory or an office, it became much more important to have a personality for anyone's success. And at this point, America became a culture that was all about presentation. According to Kane, this is a really big reason why Americans began to celebrate extroversion and why the world became a sort of hostile place for introverts. And that leads to interesting thing number 3, which is that it's pretty tough out there being an introvert. Here's an excerpt from the book to show you what I mean. Harvard's provost Paul Buck declared in the late 1940s that Harvard should reject the sensitive, neurotic type and the intellectually overstimulated in favor of boys of the healthy extrovert kind. In 1950, Yale's president Alfred Whitney Griswold declared that the ideal Yalie was not a beetle-browed, highly specialized intellectual, but a well-rounded man. Now that might seem a little bit extreme, but things really haven't changed that much over the last 50 years. Check out this article from Wharton's Business School in 2006. The business world is filled with office environments similar to the one described by an Atlanta area corporate trainer. Here, everyone knows that it's important to be an extrovert and troublesome to be an introvert. So people work real hard at looking like extroverts, whether that's comfortable or not. Now, anybody that's tried to be somebody that they're not knows that it's no fun and it sort of feels icky. But in the book, Kane says that this takes emotional labor, which leads to stress, burnout, and even physical health problems like increased risk of cardiovascular disease. The fourth interesting idea from this book is research on this concept called just right stimulation. Kane cites a study where researchers asked introverts and extroverts to play a difficult word game and listen to headphones while they did it. They were given control over the volume of the background noise, and introverts chose an average of 55 decibels, and extroverts chose an average of 72 decibels. But then researchers asked the extroverts to do the word game at the volume of the introverts, and the introverts to do the word game at the volume of the extroverts. And when they did that, introverts performed 50% slower, and extroverts performed 25% slower. That research shows that the difference between extroverts versus introverts is really about how much environmental stimulation they like. And the reason that I really liked this research is it helped explain why when I'm out at a bar with friends, I can feel distracted or find it really hard to focus. Whereas when I'm in a quiet restaurant or hanging out with some people at my house, I feel much more comfortable and like my brain is just operating at a better level. And that makes a lot of sense that in the wrong environment, I don't feel very comfortable, but in the right environment, I do. And that research sort of helps to explain why. The last thing I found interesting in this book is the research on how important it is to spend time alone. So in the book, Kane cites this now famous study where researchers asked teachers at the West Berlin Academy for Music to divide their students into two different groups. One group was what they described as the future superstars, the best violinists in their class. The other group was what they considered the more average players. And then the researchers tried to understand what were the differences in how they practiced and their different habits. And one of the things that stood out most was the amount of time that they spent practicing alone. Those future superstars, the best people in the class, practiced on average for 25 hours a week alone, whereas the average students practiced for on average 10 hours a week alone. And researchers have replicated this in a lot of different fields. Chess players, for example, that win tournaments the most, practice alone the most. The tournament winners in the chess world practice for on average 5 times more hours alone than their average peers. College athletes who practice more alone perform much better than the average athlete, and college students who study alone perform much better on tests than people that study with groups. To illustrate this idea more, she tells the story of Steve Wozniak, who co-founded Apple along with Steve Jobs. In his autobiography, Steve Wozniak wrote, "Most inventors and engineers I've met are like me. They're shy, and they live in their heads." And he advises people to embrace that nature. He says, "I'm going to give you some advice that might be hard to take. That advice is work alone." Those are the 5 things I found most interesting in this book, but I'd love to hear from you. What do you think about this whole idea of extroverts versus introverts? What do you think about personality tests in general? And what do you think about some of the studies that I mentioned in this video? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.